Welcome to the riskadvisor.com podcast. I'm Sal Lafreri, and I'm here with my good friend and co-host, Jim Henry. We hope you enjoy the show, and we're going to ask that you go to iTunes or your favorite podcast platform and give us a great rating. Your opinions mean a lot to us, and we'd like more people to log on and sign up. Today's topic, cloud-managed edge technology. Will it disrupt and potentially replace traditional infrastructure? Jim, what do you think? This is your bailiwick.
Well, I don't think it's question isn't will it, it's a matter of when, not if. It's just a process. The security industry, has been one of the more staid industries, that resisted the migration from analog to digital, taking a decade or so more than most people thought it was going to be. Because there's a lot of, conservative-minded, ex-law enforcement folks and whatnot, that make up the rank and file in security, and they're a little bit like, folks from Missouri, and they're not too willing to adapt, new platforms, new technology, new culture. But you can't argue the economics that's coming in now with the migration of, technology and the horsepower now that is out at the edge. And as we will talk during the session here, the challenges and the costs that are coming from trying to, harden your traditional on-premise infrastructure from cyber threats.
I think the key points there is, one, you don't have to think about a whole lot. And coming from that world, we never wanted to think, And what was the thing? Edison's quote, 5% of the people think, 10% of the people think they think, the other 85% would rather die than think. Yeah, it's true. All right, so with us today, we have Matthew Moreno. With over 19 years of experience in the enterprise technology, services, and physical security industry, Matthew is responsible for the development and management of the Cisco Meraki MV solution for North America. Over the years, Matt's developed and managed relationships with many large national projects, including mega city transformations with joint partnerships in commercial and government agencies. Also with us in the studio, Matthew Shanner, currently the Regional Sales Director for Cisco Meraki's commercial business for the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. He spent the majority of his career focused on physical security and facility management, helping customers reduce complexities and increase awareness. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having us.
So let's talk about, part number one here, about solving the increased cost and complexity, something that I just said, from the end user side of it, we don't want to have to think, and we're worrying about costs. So tell us a little about how do we solve that increase in costs and complexities of the internet?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the challenges that we've seen in the industry is as we've sort of gotten more specialized, specialty cameras, specialty platforms, specialty features, these systems tend to get more and more complicated with all of the different integrations and different vendors, so on and so forth. You look at a typical physical security deployment, and there's no more than, no less, I should say, than 3 vendors, right? You've got an NVR vendor, you've got a camera vendor, you've got an integrator, you've got applications developer, you've got a analytics platform, so on and so forth. And the folks that make these decisions tend to get very wowed by all of the cool technology that they see, and they see the price tag and they go, yeah, but in the name of security, we're willing to spend the money to get this technology. And then you ask them a year and a half later, how are you using it? And you ask the operators that are actually using the technology, and they all, for the most part, from all the customers we've interviewed, the vast majority of them say the same thing, which is like, we don't know how to use it. The training was too tough. The person who knew how to do it left. We've got 3 new people on staff who never learned it. All we want to be able to do is get the answer to the question, what happened when? We just want to see the video. We just want to download the clip. We just want to send it to law enforcement. These sort of basic elements that you would think every system can handle really well.
I agree with what you just said, with the fact that how many of these systems you have, people have capabilities that they just don't recognize. And how many times you go in on a consulting and you talk to someone doing an assessment and you realize that they have it. And that they're asking you, hey, can we get this? And you go, yeah, but you already got it. So we see this often. So it's a valid point.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, there's a big separation between the person using the system and the person who's making the decision to buy the system, right? Like the cool features sell really well in a presentation, but when you're actually go to use them, it becomes a challenge, right? What most people wind up doing is they start to sort of naturally attract themselves to the simplest answer to the problem, right? What's the easiest way to just get the thing that I want? And if we can provide that, if we can make it easier and in the process make it less expensive, there's no reason why a customer or an installation wouldn't start moving in that direction.
So in the quest for simplicity, the users, in trying to get to the bottom line, have been often taking shortcuts, whether it's operationally, sometimes even in the hardware. It's just too difficult to do things the right way. And as cyber threats became more and more serious, the consequences of those shortcuts are pretty consequential. I would imagine that is that's adding to the willingness of the industry, to look at a different approach.
Yeah, it's a really good point. We laugh. Cisco obviously sells a lot of things other than video surveillance, and we spoke to a customer not too long ago who was incredibly proud that their Cisco switch had not been restarted in 10 years. They showed us a screenshot of the running config that said it hadn't been restarted for 10 years, and they were so proud of it. And everyone else in the room, especially those that were security-minded, said, "You haven't patched that switch in 10 years?" and they said, like, well, I haven't needed to patch it. It's been running fine. And we're like, you can Google and vulnerabilities on our code from 10 years ago. Like, they teach that in college classes. Like, you got to upgrade that thing every time that there's new firmware out. When you start asking folks like, well, why don't you upgrade your systems more often? You get one of two answers, right? One answer is it's just too difficult to do. I've got too many components that have to upgrade with different upgrade cycles. I can't keep track of when they have to be upgraded. Or you get the I'm afraid to. I'm afraid that if I upgrade the system to the next platform, it's going to break something that I built 6-7 years ago. That integration is crucial to my operation, and if I upgrade any component of it, I'm going to break it. So you wind up having these vulnerabilities that exist as part of the thing that's trying to protect you. A good example is we hear video surveillance customers quite a bit who have workstations, right? You've got a dedicated PC that's running this piece of software. This piece of software was spec'd for a specific version of Windows on a specific type of browser, a specific type of plugin for that browser. And then the plugin goes away, or the browser has a vulnerability, so it needs to be upgraded, or the operating system goes end of life, right? Like, how many systems still operate on Windows XP? And the customer says, oh, we have a really secure infrastructure, except for the video surveillance workstation. That thing we haven't touched, because if we do, we could break the whole system. And that is one of the things that we're trying to fix, right? We're trying to fix this issue where people are afraid to upgrade, or it's too complicated to do it, or they're afraid they're going to break a bunch of things if they do. That creates more security vulnerabilities than anything else.
It gives them the downtime that they're afraid of. The camera's going to take 8 hours to fix this, and what happens if something happens during those 8 hours? Huh?
Yep,
8 hours. I mean, just recently we were talking to basically a global university that took 8 months to prepare for their upgrade for their video surveillance system, and then took another 3 months to actually execute on upgrading that. That's an incredible amount of time wasted, and certainly preparation that accounts for dollars that they didn't account for when they purchased that system, right? And this is an upgrade for just a version, let alone any kind of infrastructure or IT advantage that you're trying to attain.
So I guess Cisco finds itself now having been, really they had led the way in the deployment of most of the large scale IT infrastructure that, we have out there today. And, now they're effectively leading the way in a new topology that really is going to succeed that older architecture. And it's, because you can push a lot of these, a lot of these features and decisions and whatnot, out to the edge. So do you see that as being disrupting your own legacy?
Correct. We're not necessarily disrupting the legacy of Cisco by doing this. We're just taking advantage of basically of all of the systems that they built in the past and designing video surveillance around a different infrastructure, similar to cloud, right? Or the Meraki way, of course, with the entire Meraki product portfolio. But disrupting isn't necessarily just architecture. Of course, that is a big part of our solution, if you will, at Meraki, right? Everything on the edge, right? The compute, the storage, the video, everything that you could possibly think of, whether it was a more pervasive way of using analytics for that matter. But it's also a disruptive in the way that it goes to market, right? With how it's purchased, who's buying it, right? Whether it is being resold through channel, all of those kind of factors play into the idea of what disruptive is. And absolutely, it's definitely a disruptive kind of, to dumb it down a little bit, architecture that should change the way all of those things are perceived, right? You had mentioned, the old physical security buyer being either retired law enforcement, et cetera. And we at Meraki have identified that as not the case. They are not the buyers per se anymore. They're certainly the users, right? But the buyers are definitely more of certainly traditional IT buyers, right? CIO level type stuff, especially on large scale, enterprise type scale. But also there's a component of the software that's embedded in some of this technology that is non-physical security related, right? Talking just in vertical stretch of retail. There's analytics for merchandising and store operations, all of those things that analytics have sold in the past, but now we're putting it all into theoretically one SKU, one architecture, one type of deployment that encompasses a lot more than just a retired FBI agent buying for a bank. There is a lot more complexity into the idea of purchasing that causes that disruption, but also how you get to that person and who's selling it to them.
Yeah, and Matt, to that point, I think that it's so interesting from an edge technology perspective how powerful these edge devices really have gotten, right? If you think about just the compute power that we have in our own cell phones, right? How far that's come even just in the past handful of years. Take that same amount of compute power, put it in an enterprise edge device like a video surveillance camera that can do things like video analytics and people detection and vehicle detection and so on and so forth in an edge device. And being able to add capacity to that system just by adding a camera, not having to add a whole bunch of back-end infrastructure to be able to get any of these features. I think most of the video surveillance buyers that we're talking to today, the retired law enforcement officer is still in the room, right? For sure. They're definitely part of the decision-making process. But often we find that the conversation isn't just anymore between the security team and the C-level, right? There might be folks from marketing. There might be folks from, if it's EDU, from student retention that are saying, hey, how does the investment in the system go beyond just looking at video, right? We want to do more with this. How do we know if there's enough vehicles in a parking lot, or how many vehicles are circling a parking lot? Do we need to add spaces? How many people are using this building at certain times of day? How do we get more data out of this system? And we have a fair number of customers that use our cameras just for the analytics. They don't even look at the video. They don't even look at the photos. They just want to know how many people were in this room at this time, how many vehicles passed through this area of our campus or this drive-through during these hours, right? They don't really need to see the video. They just want the analytics. And that is a huge part of this edge processing story.
So I guess at the heart of the attractiveness here is that if you can provide that simplicity of operation, you can provide it with security, cyber security, you can make it more economical and feature rich. That's very compelling to the buyer.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm just sitting here thinking about it, and I didn't think about it when we were talking about disruptive technology, but when you started explaining about the different uses and the applications that you can have and how it cross-pollinates across the different verticals that a company would have, within retail and those operations, one of the things that security is always faced with, the biggest problem is that it's always been a cost center and nobody ever wants to spend the money on the equipment. Right? So you always try and figure it out. So at one point we would look at it and say we would install new equipment, or it would give us better capability against threats and risk, and it would give us a reduction in insurance. Well, today we understand that, you have to be at that level just to be able to get a policy, right? So, now we're back to square one, that it's a cost center for us. So the concept that you have a technology like this that can be deployed, the security directors, if they're smart, are going back to the CEOs in those meetings and saying, wait a second, time out, I need this, but you can also use it and try and associate revenue generation to it and show that where it can cost.
That's absolutely a valid point, right? When we look at the overall cost of, let's say, an intelligent endpoint, that's what we call them, right? Or sensors for that matter, or cameras, just as easy to say it that way too. You have to look at, let's call it $1,000 camera, right? We look at that as a pie chart, if you will. And it used to be that $1,000 was spent directly on the physical security buyer for risk mitigation and safety, and security for the campus or for whatever reason. But now we're saying, hey, you know what? Why don't you just cut out a portion of that $1,000 camera as part of physical security, whatever the value is in your perception of it, and then take the remaining $900 and theoretically cut it up into other components that you can extract from. So it's not just a $1,000 camera anymore for a physical security buyer. It's only a $100 camera for a physical security buyer. But then you take $300 of that camera and give it to merchandising, because there's a tremendous amount of value for them in a retail operation to see where the heat mapping is of the traffic flow for their, for their customers in the store. You can look at it as a revenue generating component for parking lots, right? Things like that, right? So the idea that the entire burden of the cost of physical security is on physical security, traditional buyer, is just out the window. We just don't play in that world anymore. It can't, right? Businesses can't afford to do that anymore because it can't be a cost center.
Let me make one comment on that. So I would say that if you spent the time actually looking at the numbers in the amount that you would save in loss prevention, to give the retail example, right? The amount you'd save in loss prevention versus, with a higher definition camera, versus the amount of customer base that you'd gain with the analytics knowing how many people were in line, how many customers came in and out of a store, what aisles they went down, so on and so forth. You're almost you far sort of outweigh the benefit in terms of how much you gain than you stand to lose, right? So if that makes any sense, the amount of loss prevention you're going to reduce versus the amount of customer knowledge that you're going to gain, the loss prevention part almost becomes a much smaller part of the overall solution, right? It's less valuable to get less loss prevention than it is to get more customer insight, if that makes sense.
Right. Well, that's a good place to break from our first segment here, and I just remind everyone that you are listening to the Risk Advisor podcast, hosted by myself, Jim Henry, and Sal Lafreri. We ask you to subscribe and follow us on our social media like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you are interested in having one or both of us speak at an upcoming event or would like to consult with us, please go to our webpage at theriskadvisor.com to set that up. So segment 2, talking about the logistics of of how this new disruptive technology platform is going to be implemented, or is likely to be implemented. So is the industry moving to a turnkey, cloud-managed video communications infrastructure inclusive of analytics to detect and classify and route video all at the edge?
Well,
yes.
Yeah, of course it is. We wouldn't be here otherwise.
Next question.
After a long question like that, we get a yes.
Matt, let me jump in for
please,
a
go
quick
ahead.
second. So I think the baseline has moved up quite a bit, right? The old baseline for video surveillance was, does it record video in a quality good enough for me to determine what happened, right? Like that was sort of the baseline for every video surveillance decision. Now that baseline has moved up to, how well does it detect vehicles and people? How well can I search through video to find an incident? How easy is it for my officers and my operators to actually do those things without having to go through hours and hours of training and retraining every time there's a new version out, so on and so forth? Because that baseline has moved up so much, you'd be really hard pressed to find a customer that looked at a Meraki video surveillance solution and said, you know what? I prefer what I used to have. I prefer to have a mix of camera vendors and NVRs and hard drives I've got to upgrade and people I've got to train. And, so it's very rare that you find a customer. I've actually never encountered one that has said, you know what, I think I'm going to stick with the old school way of doing it, right?
Probably the guy that didn't upgrade the box for 10 years.
right, exactly. It's probably the same guy. He was the only one. But I think because that baseline has moved so much, I mean, with a Meraki camera system, if you wanted to do vehicle detection, for instance, you want to know how many people are in the parking lot behind this building, you'd put up a camera, you'd point it at the parking lot. That's it. You're done. You could log on right now and see how many cars are in the parking lot. It would just automatically figure out how many vehicles it could see. It gets better with machine learning. And if it does that out of the box, you'd be really hard pressed to compare that to a solution that was far more complicated with way more components and vendors and integrators and so on and so forth to get to that same baseline. So because that baseline has shifted so much, it's hard to ignore. It's really hard to not want to at least start at that point. Now, will there be customers who need more power or corner cases or very specific analytics? Sure. And we're meeting more and more of those cases every day with our ecosystem partners and some of the integrations we're doing. But since that baseline has moved up so much, there's so many more customers in the industry now that can take advantage of what we do out of the box without having to, sort of do all of these other parts, right? The technology becomes more available to the masses, so to speak.
So some of our listeners have spent hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars on existing infrastructure, some, in many cases, very large scale video management systems and whatnot. And they're listening to this and going, oh boy, I got this huge investment out there, and I do have, a culture of an understanding and an acceptance of support of it. And I'm listening to what's, you're talking about for the future. What would you say to those clients that have that legacy, big, large deployed topology and are looking at this. Is this a forklift replacement? Is there a transition here? What would those customers, those enterprise customers, do that would be wise given the legacy investment they've got?
I'm going to let Matt answer that, but I would say to those same folks, I own a number of Blu-rays and a Blu-ray player, but when Netflix came out, I moved to Netflix like everybody else did. Why wouldn't I? Right? When the technology became available and was a better consumption model, still had all of those, that investment in Blu-rays. I had a ton of them, right? And I still had the investment in this thing, but the delivery mechanism changed. And the thing that I wanted, right, was just to be able to watch more movies. Because that shifted, my care about shifted. I no longer cared about having like the best quality, video experience. I cared a lot more about, well, what is the user experience like? How do I get access to more stuff? I still have those Blu-rays, but I haven't opened up any of those cases in years, right? I just use Netflix. So, it was the right technology decision at the time, but as sort of the industry moves forward, it's unstoppable, right? You sort of have to adapt with that process.
Yeah. And going back to the question, Jim, I mean, we do understand that there has been a tremendous amount of infrastructure built over the years, right? I mean, you sold a lot of them right here in the tri-state area, right? As well as myself. Meraki is not, blind to that component, right? So they've built the video surveillance experience the way that Matt has just described to ride on that existing infrastructure. I mean, back in the day when cameras were installed, in any kind of construction site, hands down, the lion's share of that cost was the infrastructure built, right? Just pulling the cable to the camera probably cost over 50% of the cost of the camera. Very expensive. We've identified that as well, but with a cloud or edge-based solution similar to Meraki itself, the idea of an entire forklift is just foreign. It doesn't work. We have to be able to build on infrastructures. IP in general is kind of a blanket, if you will, for standards that we can easily plug a camera into and then gain a better experience just from the installation alone. As soon as you plug in, a Meraki camera, it finds it and provisions itself on the camera, is secured, and starts recording, the way Matt described in the parking lot scenario as well. And that is absolutely the case with any of your customers' existing infrastructure, whether it's coaxial, kid you not, or IP, we can plug a Meraki camera to it. In the world of coaxial, we actually use that for power instead. And since Meraki was built on a wireless cloud solution, the camera can be viewed over your Wi-Fi network. So again, no more infrastructure needs to be built to do something like this. If you're going to take advantage of an infrastructure, you can.
So one of the things that obviously as an end user, we always thought that we get worried about it, or concerned about is we talk about cyber attacks and the risk of all of the devices that are online and and all of that sort of good stuff. So what's Cisco's plan on being able to, is this something that's built in on the edge device that you're going to be able to insulate the communications?
Yeah, sure. I'll grab that one. So there's a lot of ways to answer that, right? Because there are a lot of things that Cisco's doing. Different customers have different components, and we need to be able to cover all use cases. So on the camera itself, right, the way that we're building these camera systems today is they are essentially, self-contained video. Each camera is sort of its own self-contained video surveillance system. A single camera or two cameras or 10,000 cameras do not necessarily affect each other in terms of uptime or things like that. Each one of those cameras has chip-level security so that even if you were to get a hold of the camera, the physical camera, you would not be able to see the video that was on that camera. You could not alter the firmware on that camera. You couldn't get access to it, right? And this is not done in software. This is literally done in hardware, a chipset level layer of security that we put on the physical device. When it comes to actually accessing that stream, all of those streams are encrypted. The login mechanisms, we can use two-factor login mechanisms, but because there's less components to secure, there's sort of this natural ability to be more secure, right? There's less things that you have to guard because everything is encrypted, because the endpoints are encrypted. Even that video stream to your browser when you're viewing that video, that whole entire process is encrypted. And that's just the video surveillance system, not to mention the actual attachment of that system to the network. So one of the things that Meraki's come out with pretty recently is this concept of Secure Connect. And this right now is a Meraki access point to Meraki switch technology. But basically the way that it works, it's going to be ported over to other things eventually, including the camera system. But basically the way that it works is there is a certificate exchange between the endpoint and the network before that device even gets a DHCP address, right? Before you even allow that device to join the network to then determine if it's safe or not. Meraki on Meraki has this ability to say, hey, do you belong to this network? Do you belong to this customer? Does this customer own both switch and camera? And if the answer is yes, those devices can talk to each other. So the example being, if I took if I owned a Meraki camera and walked into your building and unplugged your Meraki camera and plugged in my Meraki camera, on most systems it would say, okay, it's another Meraki camera. I assume this one is safe to join the network. With ours, the direction we want to head with this concept of Secure Connect is the system would say, this may be a valid device, but it's not my device. I don't know who this device is, and the certificate doesn't match my certificate, so I'm not even going to let it on the network, let alone allow it to connect and configure and so on and so forth like most other devices would. And that is just scratching the surface of conversations like adaptive policy without getting too technical and without getting into too many details. It's basically a way of grouping devices on your network to say, hey, security people should be able to talk to security devices, building people should be able to talk to IoT devices, folks that manage both of those things, IT should be able to talk to both, but someone in marketing or sales shouldn't have access to those systems. And it really is as simple as that, drawing a box around a group of devices and saying, these devices can talk to those devices. And not necessarily mapping those things to, well, this device, so long as it's plugged into this port with this IP address on this network, can't talk to, whatever its counterpart is. That concept is just too complicated for most people to deploy, so they don't do it. Not to mention, if anyone ever unplugs that device and plugs it in somewhere else, it doesn't work. And now someone's got to reconfigure this whole thing. This concept of adaptive policy is supposed to smooth all of that out to make security sort of automatic. And that is, that's again, like we were talking about earlier, that is the easiest way to get to the answer, right? If we can simplify it, automate it, and make security just something that happens, not something that you have to do.
Well, that's a good lead in then for the third segment, where we'll get into a little bit more the details of that Meraki topology and how you manage that, maintain that security with the simplicity. You are listening to the Risk Advisor podcast, hosted by myself, Jim Henry, and Sal Frary. We ask that you subscribe and follow us on our social media like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you are interested in having one or both of us speak at an upcoming event or would like to consult with us, please go to our webpage at theriskadvisor.com to set that up. So, we've tossed around the name Meraki here a few times, both from the brand and and the topology. But maybe you can give us a little retrospect here as to the lineage of Meraki and why did Cisco acquire it? What's your plan for it? How are you taking it to market?
Well, you're going to get two different perspectives, actually, from the acquisition of Meraki. I mean, both Matt Shaner and I started at Cisco kind of together. He left, went to Meraki, and I stayed at Cisco, and then he came back to Cisco. So we'll start with, we'll let Matt start first, because the perception from coming into Cisco is just as important as us acquiring it. So go ahead, Matt.
Sure. I think when Cisco first acquired Meraki, there was, at least internal to Meraki, there was a lot of worry, right? Like what parts of this platform is Cisco going to take, dismantle, take bits of technology and put it in other things. But what Cisco, pretty quickly realized is Meraki was something really special in the industry. There really wasn't any other player focused on this concept of just making things simple, right? But back then in 2012, when we were acquired, the industry was really focused on how many more knobs could you have? How many more switches? How many more dials? How many more features? And we noticed that the more you talk to customers, they get overwhelmed by all of these things they've got to learn and buttons they've got to press. And there was a huge niche forming of customers saying, like, can't you just make it easy? Can't you just give me one button where I click the thing and the thing does the thing? Like, that's all I really want. I don't want to have to do all of these crazy things to get to the end goal. So like any good startup, right? We started with, somewhat of a minimum viable solution that met enough customer need where we could build some momentum. And then you look at where we've come since then, and it's a total different product line, right? Now we're as competitive as any other major enterprise networking vendor out there, with product lines in wireless and switching and firewall and mobile device management and cameras and cellular and soon to be more exciting product lines, which I won't tease quite yet, but keep an eye out. There's more stuff to come. So I think Cisco realized that they had the ability to have both, right? Cisco can still have their traditional feature-rich, powerful pieces of equipment, and they can also have the sort of the opposite of that, the still powerful but much more simpler to deploy and integrate with. And I think Cisco's happy there, right? Like we're happy having two horses in this race where we get to have both. And customers like choice, and customers like both, and they're both backed by sort of the, if nothing else, the financial security that is Cisco. There's a lot of benefit to that. So it's interesting to sort of see where the business has gone in the last 8 years, but MV is a perfect example, right, of a new product line. Cisco had started to sunset their vSUN product. We came out with this new MV product, which sort of, again, reinvents our entry into the market and how we're taking a look at it. And as far as Cisco is concerned, great. Like, now we have a new product that people really like, so be it. Why put a bullet in that horse, right? Like, we can just keep it going. And that's sort of been my experience so far. It's been nothing but good the past 8 years. I have no complaints whatsoever. The product does well. The technology gets better. We're moving up market at lightning speed. It's all coming up roses for Meraki.
Yeah. I mean, when I was there, when we made the acquisition, it's important to know is like, the perception was that there were outsiders coming into Cisco, right? Not independently. I knew Matt prior, but it was, okay, what is Meraki bringing besides just a really cool piece of technology in the cloud, right? It's non, traditional Cisco. They acquired the culture of Meraki, which is infectious across the board, right? It is just an incredible cultural shift, just not in personnel, but also the tech they had acquired. But one thing that, if you've kind of been listening to Matt really carefully, we don't build features at Meraki. We build solutions, right? That's kind of like our mantra. And that was very foreign for us to hear, even before MV was part of the discussion, right? Before we actually had cameras at the Meraki piece. And seeing that, making that one thing work when you press the one button they were proving that to us. And we were all just dumbfounded, for that matter, just seeing it work. And then when MV came out, the idea that we can do the exact same thing with video surveillance, and I was selling the older type of architecture with Cisco, right? And competing in that market. Now I saw something that just made sense. The passion resonates across the product. And it was very important to see that as the transition of them becoming Cisco'd, right, from Meraki. And it was just really cool, right, in that context. Important.
So let's kind of zero in here on the security element. You talked, Matt, earlier in segment 2 about the Secure Connect topology and what have you, and some customers, throwing up their hands, looking at all these headlines of hack after hack after hack after hack from the internet, and some CEOs and CISOs saying the only way to insulate yourself from the internet is get off the goddamn thing, right? So you have some, end users that have gone the direction of a private cellular network, to get that security. So is Secure Connect compatible with that element of communicate with that topology of communications out to your edge devices? I mean, how does that? Can you have your cake and eat it too? There,
it's a good point. So I think when you're looking at security, you can sort of subdivide it into 2 main categories, right? There's external threats and there's internal threats. When it comes to internal threats, even physical internal threats, right? I went to a customer once who told me, looked me straight in the eye and said, "I don't trust the cloud because the cloud is not secure. I don't own the cloud, so I can't trust it." And while we were having this conversation, by the way, there was no lobby ambassador or anyone sitting at the front desk. I just walked right into the building. There was nobody who asked me who I was. I just found my way to the conference room and sat down. As we were talking, I could see a network closet that was propped open with a cinder block because the cooling system wasn't working and the door was open. And I'm looking at him and I'm like, I could just walk into that door, right? Like, you're worried about the cloud security aspect of a multi-million-dollar, SaaS secured cloud that has to go through all these certifications and penetration testing, and have physical security with, 2-factor and biofactor and armed guards. And you're worried that it's less secure than the closet you've got propped open with a cinder block and no security between your front door and that closet. Like, really take a second to think about what you're saying here. So from the internet bound threat, that's always going to be a challenge, right? The folks that are using those attack vectors are always going to be in lockstep, if not a step ahead of the industry, and we're always going to be chasing them, right? So the best thing you can do is early detection, right? And then making sure once those threats are known is limiting your exposure to those threats as quickly as possible. And that's a huge piece of what we were talking about earlier when it comes to doing the upgrades. Right. Once you're notified that there's a threat or that there's a new vulnerability out there, going through the process of then securing your external, paths of entry, that's got to be super easy, right? You've got to be able to click a button and have all those things upgraded. You can't go through a process where it's now going to take you 8 months of prep to do 3 months worth of security. By then, you've already been hacked, right? You took too long. And that's the whole conversation with external. With internal threats, devices still need to be able to talk to each other internally, right? You still need to be able to bring things onto the network. That's where Secure Connect comes in. Locally, in a single location or in multiple locations, those devices still have to get access to each other and access to the internet, or access to a network rather, and then access to other resources, so on and so forth. And I think doing some of this edge security in terms of encryption at the edge, encryption during transport, it helps sort of embolden those types of technologies, even inside of private cellular connections, right? Because even inside of those connections, there's still going to be components that have access. And just sort of by way of quick example, there was a retailer who I'm sure many of you will figure out who I'm talking about when I say what I'm about to say, who got hacked not through an external, internet-bound attack, but through their heating and cooling system. And they were able to jump over to their credit card management system. And that heating and cooling system, you could do private cellular all day long, but if your building management folks chose to go with a heating and cooling vendor that have their own connection to the internet, or have some kind of vulnerability that you're not protecting internally, it's just another door, right? It's just another hole in the network. So you have to be aware of both, right? You have to limit your exposure to your internet-bound threats and your external threats, but you also have to pay attention to your internal threats. Are you locking your windows and doors at night? Kind of a thing.
So for the last question, we got to wrap up, but sort of a relatively quick point. So is Meraki working with other global developers, with respect to, some obviously more information is going to be pushed through, more capability, higher bandwidth. So that's going to become problematic. It's going to be questions that are going to be asked. How do you guys address those efficiencies?
Well, we address the efficiencies with the architecture itself. I mean, but to answer your first question about, ecosystem partners, of course, when it comes to, the camera and the analytics that we can extract, or the data that we can extract from the camera and give it to an analytics company, and they can make, business intelligence processes to give to customers. That is certainly available today in the context of what the camera can do. But the architecture, kind of, at least from the MV and our architecture, defines and kind of extinguishes the bandwidth concern generally, right? If you, obviously you guys had done a little research on the product itself. If you notice that all of our cameras, the entire, compute mechanism is on board at the edge, right? It is a compute mechanism. It is a storage mechanism. It is a image processing mechanism. It also has a chipset that is very similar to what we find in cellular phones, right? So it is basically an entire system at the edge, right? And it doesn't, in a sense, broadcast video exponentially, as live stream normally would in, what I call terrestrial type of video surveillance systems. It is only on demand, and it's only one, at 1-to-1 type of the viewing ratio. So your bandwidth constraints are really non-existent. That's why we can basically scale as fast as we had in such a short term, is because, most of our customers have identified that as usually a big problem, which is the reason why you brought it up, that when they're making a new, purchase in an IP surveillance system, the edge looks so attractive to them because now they don't have to worry about building an infrastructure to support just the bandwidth alone to get high quality video when necessary.
Yeah, to add on to that, I would say that the integrations that we're looking to do with ecosystem partners are sort of more business outcome focused than they are, point product focused, right? We're less interested in supporting another vendor's cameras on our network because that doesn't really add the value that we want to the business outcome of. I want to know, I had this ability, for instance, right, the MV camera to detect cars. Well, that's great, but that's really all it does is just detect cars. It doesn't really go beyond that. So there's a number of ecosystem partners that we work with that can do things like, I want to count the number of cars and tell you if there's spots available. I want to tell you if someone's been waiting in a drive-through line for X amount of time. Those are things that we can enable, but we don't do natively, right? We have to use ecosystem partners to be able to do some of that stuff. Now, if you were to say to me, yeah, but I've got this very specific camera that I want to bring onto your system, well, the business outcome of that is not really as valuable as, the business outcome of adding a camera to the system is not nearly as valuable as adding, what do we actually want to get out of the system, right? What is the process, or what is the data that we actually want out? So most of the ecosystem integrations we're doing today are not camera vendors or NVR vendors or anything really in the traditional competitive space. It's more in the business outcome space. It's more in being able to do things like, social distance monitoring or capacity planning or contact tracing or, something more where the partners that we were working with building these platforms to enable us to get data rather than sort of hardware integrations, if that makes sense.
So those analytic developers are making their case of the why, and that's the judgment that you're using as to which ones to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just in the greater Meraki sense, just during the pandemic over the last few months, we've added about 28 COVID-specific apps to the Meraki App Store for addressing a need that didn't exist, just a handful of months ago. We had customers coming to us and saying like, hey, what do I do? The governor of my state just said I'm only allowed 50% of the people in my retail chain, and I've got 100 of these locations. How the heck am I going to manage that? Like, how do I know if I'm in compliance? We say, like, check out the Meraki App Store. All you have to do is like press this button and boom, now you got a dashboard that tells you, what your capacity is for every site. You didn't have to roll out a whole bunch of hardware and take, 6 months to do it, right? You asked for it on Monday and it was up and running by Friday and you're good to go.
Well, that agility certainly is very, very attractive because who knows what tomorrow is going to bring, right?
Correct. But that's also the component of VSaaS in general, video software as a service in general. The idea that, paying a monthly subscription fee for a device seems, quite foreign to especially traditional physical security buyers. But as an added benefit to that, you are getting those types of upgrades, right? Or access to those types of upgrades from those fees that you're buying because you're basically, supporting the idea that we can go out and find ecosystem partners for you to be able to do these types of things. That's exactly what VSaaS, the business model is designed around. It's important to know that.
Well, I'd like to thank both Matt Shaner and Matt Moreno for being our guests today. This has been very, very enlightening, very engaging. You have been listening to the Risk Advisor podcast, hosted by myself, Jim Henry, and Sal Lafreri. We ask you to subscribe to this show and like us on our social media sites like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you are interested in having one or both of us speak at an upcoming event or would like to consult with us, please go to the webpage at theriskadvisor.com to set that up. Remember, you can hear the show on your favorite podcast platform, YouTube, and of course, stream it at theriskadvisor.com. Thanks again for listening, and we hope you tune in again next week.